This is the story of March 14th, 1965. Harlem, New York City. A Tuesday night that erased a man from the face of the earth and sent a message written not in ink, but in something far darker. A night that people who were there still refused to discuss openly. A night that veterans of the Harlem underworld, men who had seen shootings and stomp-downs and bodies rolled into the East River, still describe in hushed voices with their eyes cast down. This is the story I was told never to write. I first heard about it in 2001. I was in a diner on 125th Street, talking to an old numbers runner named Cleveland who went by the name Threads, on account of the way he dressed. He was 81 years old, his hands thick with arthritis, his suit still immaculate. We had been talking for 2 hours about the old Harlem, about the way things worked before everything changed, about Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the man the whole world knew as Bumpy. And then Thread said something that stopped me cold. He put down his coffee cup, looked at the table, and said, "You know about the night the Italian spit on the boy?" I told him I did not. He looked up at me slowly. 200 people saw it, he said. 200 people saw what happened after. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, slumped over a plate of food at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, his heart finally surrendering after years of Rikers Island, of war with the Italians, of keeping Harlem from tearing itself apart. He was 62 years old, and he had lived 10 men's worth of life in those years. But before he died, there was a boy. There was always the boy. His name was Marcus. I will not give his last name because living members of his family have asked me not to, and I respect that request. Marcus had been born in 1949 to a woman named Celestine, who worked the laundry on 133rd Street and who died of tuberculosis in the winter of 1957, when Marcus was 8 years old. His father had been gone since before his birth. He had no uncles, no grandparents still living. He had nobody, and in the world of Harlem in 1957, having nobody was a kind of death sentence all its own. Bumpy Johnson made the boy his godson 2 months after Celestine died. This was not unusual for Bumpy. People who described him to me over the years always struggled with the contradiction of it, because Bumpy Johnson was simultaneously one of the most dangerous men in New York City and one of the most generous. He ran the numbers in Harlem. He controlled the flow of money through corridors that the police either couldn't or wouldn't touch. When the Genovese family tried to push into Harlem in the early 50s, it was Bumpy who held the line, who made them understand that certain territories were non-negotiable. He had killed men. He had ordered men killed. He had sat in prison and read Kant and come out quoting philosophy to men who expected him to talk about revenge. He was a paradox that Harlem both feared and loved, and when he took Marcus in, nobody was surprised. That was Bumpy. Marcus grew up under that shadow. He was educated, soft-spoken, serious. By 1965, he was 16 years old and working peripherally in the edges of the organization. Nothing dangerous, nothing that would put him in direct lines of fire. Running messages, being present, learning. Bumpy kept him close but not too close, the way you keep a flame away from something you don't want to burn. He was protective of the boy in a way that people noticed. In a world where sentiment was typically weaponized, where your affections could be turned against you, Bumpy's love for Marcus was one of the few open truths. Everyone knew it, which meant everyone knew what it meant to touch the boy. The Italian's name was Carmine Vitale, 44 years old, born in Naples, operating out of the Lucchese family's Manhattan operations as a mid-level enforcer with ambitions that far exceeded his position. He was not a boss. He was not even a capo. He was a soldier who had been rewarded with some latitude in the lower end of Manhattan and who had, in the judgment of several people I spoke to over the years, badly miscalculated his own importance. One former associate told me, speaking on the condition of anonymity from a retirement community in Fort Lauderdale, that Carmine Vitale was the kind of man who confused being feared in a small room with being powerful in the world. He had a temper that his own people found difficult to manage. He drank. He talked too much. He had survived mostly because he was competent enough at the brutal mechanics of his job to make himself useful, and because nobody above him had yet grown tired enough of his excesses to do something about it. In early March of 1965, a dispute over a numbers territory in East Harlem had created friction between Bumpy's operation and the Lucchese family's peripheral interests. It was the kind of dispute that got resolved through intermediaries, through patiently negotiated arrangements over dinner tables in restaurants where nobody raised their voice. Bumpy was not a man who enjoyed unnecessary conflict. He was calculating, not impetuous. But Vitali apparently had his own opinion about how the matter should be handled, and about the Harlem organization generally, an opinion shaped by the particular brand of racism that ran through certain segments of the Italian-American mob, like a fault line beneath smooth ground. The night of March 14th, there was a gathering at a social club on Pleasant Avenue in East Harlem. It was a social event in the loosest sense, a collection of men from various circles, Italian and otherwise, who coexisted in the economy of the street. There were perhaps 200 people present over the course of the evening. Card players, neighborhood men, associates, hangers-on, people whose business it was to be seen in rooms where things happened. Marcus was there because one of Bumpy's lieutenants had sent him with a message for a man at the club, a simple errand that should have taken 10 minutes. What happened next is something I have spent years reconstructing from the accounts of 8 people who were present. They do not disagree on what occurred. They disagree on whether it was stupidity, provocation, or something closer to madness. Carmine Vitale saw Marcus in the corridor near the back of the club. Vitale had been drinking. According to 2 witnesses who were standing nearby, Vitale said something to Marcus, something about Bumpy, something that contained the particular kind of venom that certain men reach for when they want to make a point through someone smaller than themselves. Marcus, 16 years old, did not respond. He had been taught not to respond. He kept his face neutral and his eyes steady, which apparently enraged Vitale further, because what happened next happened in front of everyone within sight of that corridor. Carmine Vitale looked at the boy who was Bumpy Johnson's godson, a boy of 16 with no father and no mother, and nothing in the world except the shadow of a man who loved him, and he spat in his face. The room went silent in the way rooms only go silent when everyone present understands simultaneously that something has just occurred that cannot be undone. An older man near the bar put down his glass and did not pick it up again for a very long time. A card game at a nearby table stopped mid-hand. 2 men near the door exchanged a look that one of them would describe to me 36 years later as the look men give each other when they watch someone dig their own grave and keep shoveling. Marcus did not move, did not react. He wiped his face with the back of his hand with a stillness that witnesses found more memorable than any violent response would have been. He turned, he walked out of the club, and within the hour, word had reached Bumpy Johnson. The man who told Bumpy was a lieutenant named Samuel, who went by the name Prince. Prince had been with Bumpy since before Rikers. He had seen Bumpy in every state of emotion that a man could inhabit. He told me in 2003 that he had never in his life been afraid to deliver news to Bumpy Johnson until that night. Every other time, Prince said, no matter what it was, you could read Bumpy when you walked in. You could feel what you were walking into. That night, when I told him, there was nothing to read. That was the part that scared me, the absence of what should have been there. Bumpy Johnson said 4 words. Prince remembered them exactly because he turned them over in his mind for decades afterward, examined them like artifacts from an excavation. Bumpy said, "Bring Marcus to me." And then he said nothing else for the rest of the evening. I want to be precise about what I know and what I don't know, because precision matters in a story like this. I know that Carmine Vitale was alive on the night of March 14th, 1965. I know that by the morning of March 22nd, 1965, he was not. I know that what was discovered in a warehouse space near the Hunts Point markets in the Bronx on that morning was identified as Vitale only through the partial presence of a distinctive nautical tattoo on what remained of his left forearm. The detective who filed the initial report, a man I located through public records and spoke to briefly before he declined further conversation, told me only that in 22 years on the force he had never filed a report that he found more difficult to complete. He used the word thorough. He said what had been done to Carmine Vitale was thorough in a way that communicated something beyond punishment. It communicated deliberateness, patience, an intent not merely to end a life, but to send a letter in a language that everyone who received it would understand completely. The Lucchese family did not retaliate. This, to those who understood that world, was the most eloquent statement of all. An Italian-American crime family in 1965, learning that one of their soldiers had been killed in this manner, did not retaliate. They did not demand a sit-down, did not send an envoy, did not make any of the formal gestures that the protocols of that world required. They absorbed it. They adjusted their operations away from certain territories. And within the organization itself, according to a source who spent years in rooms adjacent to these conversations, The name of Carmine Vitale was essentially retired from memory with a swiftness that made clear what the family's internal assessment of his conduct had been. He had violated something fundamental, not just protocol, something older and more basic than protocol. He had put his hands, or in this case, something considerably worse than his hands, on a child, on someone's child. And in a world built entirely on codes of loyalty and the weight of relationships, there was a universal ledger that even enemies read from the same page. I spent years trying to find out exactly what Bumpy Godson ordered, who carried it out, and how. I found fragments. I found suggestions. I found men who would tell me everything except the thing I was asking about, circling the center of it with elaborate care. What I did learn is this: it was not impulsive. Nothing Bumpy Godson did was impulsive. There was a week between the night in the club and the morning in the Bronx, and that week was not a week of rage. It was a week of geometry, of calculation, of a man deciding with full deliberation exactly what a message needed to say and exactly how loud it needed to be said. What I know about Bumpy Godson, from every account I ever collected, is that he was not a cruel man. He was not a man who took pleasure in suffering. He was a man who had grown up in a world that assigned different values to different lives based on the accident of their birth, and who had built an entire counter-economy in defiance of that calculus, who had fed people, protected people, educated people, even as he operated within the machinery of something that a law-abiding citizen would rightly call criminal. He was a man who had taken in a motherless, fatherless boy and made of himself a shelter. And someone had walked up to that shelter and, in front of 200 witnesses, made it known that it could be violated without consequence. The response said, "There are consequences." The thoroughness of the response said, "There are especially consequences for doing this to a child." Marcus finished school. He went on to work legitimately, in business, far from the streets. He outlived most of the men of his world. I found him through a chain of contacts and wrote him a letter in 2005, asking to speak with him about Bumpy and about 1965. He wrote back, in a very clear and formal hand, a single paragraph. He said that Bumpy Godson was the finest man he had ever known. He said that the care Bumpy showed him formed the foundation of everything decent in his life. He said he had no comment on any specific events from the 1960s, and he said that he thought about his godfather every single day. I have thought a great deal about what Bumpy Godson understood that perhaps others didn't. In the criminal world in which he operated, violence was currency. You spent it and you received it in return. It was transactional, brutal, and ultimately exhausting. But what Bumpy did in March of 1965 was something different. It was not transactional, it was declarative. It was the statement of a principle so basic that it required no explanation. That a child under your protection is sacred, and that the man who desecrates that sanctity has made an appointment with consequences that no family, no flag, and no amount of criminal prestige can cancel. 200 people saw Carmine Vitale spit on that boy, which meant 200 people also received the letter that was written 8 days later in a warehouse in the Bronx. The letter was not addressed to any one person. It was addressed to everyone. It said, "This is where the line is." It said, "Some things are not about business." It said, "Know the difference between the things you can do and the things you cannot." Bumpy Godson died 3 years later, in 1968, without ever having been charged with anything related to those 8 days in March. The investigation, such as it was, went nowhere. It went nowhere in the particular way that certain investigations in certain jurisdictions in certain eras went nowhere, which is to say that the men involved in conducting the investigation were themselves sometimes operating in the same economy of silence and obligation that made the event possible in the first place. That world was a closed system. What happened inside it stayed inside it, sealed by a code that outlasted most of the men who lived by it. There is a photograph of Bumpy Godson that was taken sometime in 1966, a year after that march. He is standing outside on a Harlem street, looking off to one side, not posing. He is wearing a good coat. His face is older than his years, the way all men's faces get old when they have carried things that most people are not required to carry. But there is something else in that face, something that the people who knew him said was always there but became more visible after 1965. A kind of resolution, a settled quality, as though an argument that had been running for a long time had finally been answered, and the answer had not surprised him, but it had cost him something to give it. He loved that boy. The love of a man with no children of his own for a child with no parents of his own, meeting in the middle of the world's indifference, and making from that meeting something that neither of them could have built alone. Someone tried to reach through that love and use it as an instrument of humiliation. And Bumpy Johnson, with the full measure of who he was and what he was capable of, made certain that the attempt was also the last attempt. This is not a celebration of violence. I want to be clear about that, because I think Bumpy Johnson himself would insist on it. This is a story about what it cost to protect someone, about the fact that protection, real protection, is not a gentle thing. It is sometimes a terrible thing, purchased at prices that cannot be paid back and cannot be undone. Bumpy Johnson paid that price. He paid it without hesitation, and he lived with the weight of it for the remaining 3 years of his life. And he never spoke about it publicly, and neither did the men who carried out his instructions, and neither did the family that received the message and chose, wisely, to read it correctly. 200 people witnessed that Tuesday night in March. Most of them are gone now. The ones who remain do not speak about it. But somewhere in the sediment of Harlem's memory, in the stories that old men tell in diners, and the things that older women whisper to each other when talking about how things used to work and who used to make them work that way, the story exists. It has always existed. It was passed from mouth to ear across decades, never written down, never recorded, sealed by the same silence that Bumpy himself would have demanded. Until now. Some stories deserve to be remembered, not because they are clean, not because they offer comfortable lessons, but because they are true, because real human beings lived through them and were changed by them. Because a man who the world filed under criminal spent 8 days making certain that a teenage boy would grow up knowing that the cruelty of the powerful does not go unanswered, that someone was watching, that he was not alone. Marcus is in his 70s now, somewhere. He thinks about Bumpy Johnson every single day. So do I.